Welcome everyone to I4CP's Next Practices Weekly. We've got a great guest and topic lined up for today, which we'll get to momentarily. If you're new to Next Practices Weekly, we are I4CP, the Institute for Corporate Productivity. We're your human capital research partner. We discover the people practices that drive high performance. We do this in a variety of ways. First and foremost, our major research studies, of which we do 5 or 6 every year. We look at organizations that are high performers, compare their results on various HR practices to the low performing companies out there. We look at revenue growth, market share, profitability, customer satisfaction. That's how we define high performance. We're also a member-based community, so beyond our research studies, we provide a lot of peer interaction, including here publicly at Next Practices Weekly, but also through our many exchange groups, member flash calls, our boards, and other ways as well, including our conference, which I'll speak to at the end of the call today, because that's coming up fast. You see here just a small sampling of some of the logos of members in the I4CP community. They range from very large companies, Microsoft, 3M, Visa, Accenture, Amazon. We've also got a growing cohort of startup organizations, whether it's in tech or biotech or otherwise. We've got regional banks, regional hospital systems, really spans across all industry verticals. If you're with one of our member companies and with us on the line today, great to have you with us. Special welcome to you. If you're not with a member company but would like to learn more about what that implies, what that entails, the benefits, just reach out to anyone at I4CP or go to our website, i4cp.com, and we'll be happy to get you that information. My name is Tom Stone. I'm a senior research analyst here at I4CP, and most weeks I have the pleasure of co-hosting Next Practices Weekly. And this week, once again, returning back is another senior research analyst here at I4CP, my colleague, Katheryn Brekken. Good morning, Katheryn.
Morning, Tom.
Good to have you with us. You'll be facilitating the conversation with someone that you know pretty well, who we'll bring on in just a moment. But a few other quick announcements before we get to that. This is Next Practices Weekly, and most weeks we do gather here at Thursday at 11 a.m. Eastern, 8 a.m. Pacific. We won't be meeting the next 2 weeks. Our conference is coming up, so obviously that week we wouldn't be meeting, and to sort of prep for that, we won't be meeting next week either. But coming up in March, we'll have Rob Cross, our SVP of Research. He's always a delight and sort of a fire hose of great information, so you won't want to miss that one. And then in April, you see we've got leaders coming to us from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and Symetra. A couple of other things. We do hold less frequently than every week, but we do hold events at different dates and times that are more appropriate and geared time-wise for our friends and colleagues that are around the globe, particularly the EMEA region time zones and the APAC time zones. So coming up soon, February 26th, Lori Likens and John Sutton will be walking through our 2025 priorities and predictions. We've done that here on the Thursday Next Practices Weekly, but for those that are in different time zones, you see the times there for folks in India, Singapore, Sydney on February 26th. Please do share this with any of your global colleagues. There's a QR code on screen, but also a link over in chat if this would be a good session for some of your global colleagues. Also wanted to note, the Workforce Readiness in the Era of AI study was recently released. This is one that Katheryn, that you were the lead researcher on, and I know you and me and others have been presenting on some of the findings of this to our members. We also had a recent public webinar where you and another colleague, Amber Burton, presented on some of the findings of this. So folks on this call could find the recording of that. That was just last week or the week before, I think February 12th.
A blur.
Yeah, and so that webinar is out there and available, and of course you can download the brief, and if you're a full member of I4CP, you can download the full report. And so with that, I'm going to now turn things over to you, Katheryn, to help facilitate our conversation today and introduce our special guest.
Thank you so much, Tom. I'm so excited to be here. And just an aside about my role, I'm also the lead researcher that supports I4CP's People Analytics Board. And I have had the pleasure of knowing Buddy, I think it's been 3 years now. He is one of our members on the board. I like to call him, probably more so behind his back, because I think this would make him blush, the sage of analytics. And I think you're going to see why. Buddy, let's hear a little bit more about you. You've had a very long, successful career in HR, including work at Raytheon, Owens Corning, Monsanto, and Bayer. And now, over the past 4 years, you've been head of talent insights at Edward Jones. Can you tell us briefly about your journey that brought you here today?
Thank you so much, Katheryn, and definitely I will blush a lot with that compliment. So I appreciate that. Yeah, I have number one. I am originally from Mississippi, so my Southern accent will slip up from time to time. So if I say anything that's unintelligible, please just forgive me, and I'll come back to it as we go through it. There's some words I will let you know that I have a hard time saying. Mentor is one of them, so it comes out as mentor, and people don't know if I'm talking about development or fishing. So just keep that in mind as we go through. And if there's anything we need to clarify, we'll come back to it. So as we go through, I am Buddy. I have been with Edward Jones for 4 years. So I lead human capital insights or talent insights at Edward Jones, it's been my pleasure. I have the privilege and pleasure of leading an amazingly gifted team of associates here at the firm, which is exciting. And Edward Jones just recently, we surpassed 20,000 financial advisors in the U.S., which I'm also really excited to talk about and talk a little bit about the firm before I talk about myself, which is kind of a shortcoming of mine. But as we go through it, the firm has over 54,000 associates. So as you go through, a lot of people don't realize Edward Jones has the third most amount of physical branches in the United States of any company. So only behind Subway and Starbucks. So as we go through, so many of you may be familiar when you see an Edward Jones office as you drive home today. We're really excited about that and hope that everyone comes and thinks about Edward Jones for your financial services needs as we go through it. So really excited about that. And overall, we serve over 8 million individual investors, and we are responsible for over $2 trillion in assets under care. So, and we are also in Canada, in the US. We're actually in 68% of counties in the United States as well, physically. So we are literally everywhere. So we thank everybody here. If you are an Edward Jones client, we thank you, but we also think, if you're thinking about it in the future, highly encourage you as we go through it. But Buddy, yeah, my journey is really interesting. So somebody might ask, how did someone, I was born in, Natchez, Mississippi. Now I start at the very beginning as we go through all this, but I had a unique background in getting into people analytics and getting through it. So I actually started because I worked on coding a game for AOL back when I was 18 years old, unpaid, which I didn't think much about it. They actually paid me in free AOL, which you might go, Buddy, that's not a great financial decision for it, but I thought it was fun at the time. So that's how I actually learned how to code, and I started coding, and then you might go, well, Buddy, where did your, education go from? My actual undergrad degree is in history. So a lot of times people think, well, how'd you get into analytics with a background in history? But I really loved the data part about history, and I really love the economics of a lot of parts of history. So I was really studying economics and history together as part of that. And then as we went through it, I finished it up. And just as you do, if you have a degree in history in Mississippi from a small liberal arts college, I did not have a job coming out of college. So I was literally in the middle of a ditch digging, and I became a supervisor at a construction company. And my very first HR question and my very first analytics question, and it's actually still one of the keys to what we do today, was how do you get someone to come to work? Because I made a rookie management mistake on Friday of telling everybody what we would be doing on Monday, which in this case was digging ditches as we went through it. And I literally had to dig the ditches by myself. And so I said, Buddy, at the end of that 10 to 12-hour day, I said, how do I get people to come to work? Right. That was my first initial. And it's been the people analytics question of my life, actually, as we go through it. So as part of that, I then ended up going to school for human resources. So I have my master's in industrial and labor relations from Cornell. And much like a lot of my career story, also completely random chance is my wife. And this year, she won't listen to this, but this year is our 20th year together. but she did not move to New York with me for it. And so I was living in a 125 square foot studio apartment in Ithaca, New York, with no my fiance being in Mississippi at the time, no income and anything else. So I had a lot of time on my hands. And luckily, that led me to going and studying statistics as well as human resources while I was in at grad school. So I finished school. I ended up joining Raytheon, which was a wonderful company, wonderful organization. And had joined their leadership development program, but I was really passionate about the data components. And so I was doing data stuff way back before it was fun or cool. And so I built my first dashboard in Excel with Visual Basic way back when, just because I was tired of pulling it all together as we go through. And that was 20 plus years ago. So it started all of that path. And then I ended up getting the joy, and many people in the call, if you're familiar with strategic workforce planning or people analytics, I had the joy of being mentored and having Robert Motion as my boss, who is one of the really key first proponents of strategic workforce planning. And so that's how I fell into this space. So now I'm particularly ancient in this space. So I've been in people analytics for over 17 years now, pretty much in the space. And then I got the opportunity to lead and create people analytics at Monsanto. And that was also where I first was able to start doing what I would call the strategic studies that have helped shape me. Like, for example, what makes a great leader? The questions that really have consumed me is, how do you get to what makes a great leader? What makes a great employee? How do we understand attrition? How do we understand teams? All of these components really started with my path at Monsanto, and then ultimately Bayer. My last role at Bayer, I was the vice president of digital HR innovation, which was a combination of both analytics and kind of emerging tech. And then I had the opportunity with COVID. I'd been traveling pre-COVID. I'd been traveling internationally for almost 3 years. So I'd done 330,000 miles in the air, which I know some people on the call are probably familiar with, in 1 year. And COVID hit. And I have known Edward Jones and had a lot of respect. I was a client of Edward Jones before joining, but I looked at my wife during COVID and said, "Hey, it's good to see you again. Actually, this part is good." And it was time for a change. And so, like I said, since then, I've had the ultimate pleasure and privilege of leading people analytics at Edward Jones, where we've grew. When I started at Edward Jones, we were really starting up people analytics. So we started with 3 folks in our team, and now we're up to 20. And so it's been a real blessing and a real privilege to get there.
You have so much range, Buddy. You have a really impressive career and educational journey, and I can't believe you're a gamer, a historian, statistician, HR leader. There's so much that you bring to this role, and people analytics is a relatively new field. Having 17 years in it, and knowing too that many people on the call are probably just building their own people analytics team. We know from our benchmarking data that 20% of companies don't even have a people analytics team. Another 20% have about a team of one. Tell us about your team, what it looks like now, and how did you grow that? How did you get there?
It's Katheryn, it's such a great piece. When we start, the first part I always think about is you have to go through the development curve. So many people want to jump the development curve of maturity as we go through it. So, and if you think about that maturity curve, people always want to get to predictive, optimized, analytics, artificial intelligence, before they've actually made the preliminary jumps of how to get there. So the first part of starting a great analytics function, in my belief, is getting to the questions that matter, because the questions that matter is what's going to get you to the products that matter. And that's really what you're aiming for as you think about it. So our team right now, and I feel really blessed, we actually just went through our operating model last year, and we have a lot of new team members that have been with our team for a year. But our team is made up of 4 separate teams, and because we're on our own evolution. And I'll talk a little bit about what that evolution is too, and why I think that's the future. So our team is made up of, our first team is made up of, it's called Talent Intelligence, which historically was human capital reporting. And it's in the middle of an evolution from that human capital reporting to talent intelligence. And I think that's really a requirement today in the age of artificial intelligence, where a lot of basic reporting functions, that the fundamentals of that job are shifting. dramatically as we go through it. And so that part, as you're thinking about human capital reporting, understanding what the future of that looks like, especially with some of the vendors that are out there and what's going through, it's going to change dramatically. And it has to shift from just reporting and sending people over data to bringing the insights and the intelligence that are around that completely. The second group that we have is what we call people analytics, and that's a traditional people analytics part, and that's about answering the most important questions that we can have. So we accomplish anywhere between 30 to 40 different analytics projects a year. Some years we get up to the 70 to 80 parts, and that's really how do you fundamentally answer and ask and answer questions in the process for how do we look and do that. So that becomes really huge as we're thinking about what is that next step in people analytics. And there's a lot of that which goes from artificial intelligence, but a lot of it is just how do we continuously get better at good consulting and the actual asking of questions in the best way. And then our third group is our survey group. So that's our colleague experience survey. So many of y'all will recognize that for engagement surveys, but we actually have a whole listening suite. So we have onboarding and exit surveys. We have, a complete swath. So we end up doing between 25 and 30 different surveys a year. And so we have two wonderful associates that help lead that who are experts in that. And then our last group, which is I'm really excited, is a kind of a birthing of a whole different area, and we'll talk a little bit about the evolution, is our assessments and evaluations team. And so at Edward Jones, we do assessments for all of our associates, and we also have the evaluation piece, which is how do we understand the return on investment for all of our different programs that we're running at the firm. So that could be anything from any learning interactions we're going to have and what the future of that looks like, to how do we understand our learning outputs and pieces as we look through it. So on each team, I just saw this question pop up. I'll answer it really quickly since it's easy. On our talent intelligence team, we have 5 individuals. On our surveys team, we have 2 individuals. On our people analytics team, we have 4 individuals. And on our assessments and evaluation team, we have 8 individuals as we go through. And so as we look through that, why is it grouped that way? And you might say, Buddy, how did this happen? Well, the natural part was, the first part was people analytics and surveys, because we had to run surveys. So that's a product that has to come out that the firm is asking. And our people analytics team was what we were going through and really building. But the kind of the goal is the future. And this is where I think one of the future of people analytics is going is I think there will be 3 subgroups of topics of people analytics that we get really interested in. The first one is talent intelligence, because I think that is part of the future of understanding really what human capital reporting, but also maybe the first level of people analytics becomes. And then from a people analytics standpoint, I think the questions that come out will continue to get more interesting. This is also where areas like, and some people keep this separate in their organizations, but where does strategic workforce planning, talent strategy, all of that blend into people analytics? Because I do think there's a lot of blend over of those 3 areas and how they're supported with one another. And then the last group, which is I think what will happen was, this is a Buddy belief. So, that and I guess due to inflation, $6 will get you a cup of coffee, right? As you build up. But the last part will be behavioral science. And I know some areas have really tried that, but I think it's partially because of where the data availability is and the structure of that is. But where surveys are going and what you're really trying to influence and understand there is behavior. And then at the last part too is when you think about assessments, that is very behaviorally focused. And when we think about evaluations of programs, the ultimate part is, did we shift behaviors that we were looking to shift to get to the return that we're looking for? So those 3 areas I do see as the heavy future of human capital as analytics as we're going forward, and what people analytics will be in the future, especially with how AI will complement all 3 areas.
We did have some questions in the chat about how you are leveraging AI to do all of this.
We are going through, so we are really, because of wonderful, and I do mean this, because of FINRA and SEC, we have a lot of regulations here at the firm, right? And I know a lot of other folks here are in that. So we're going through an AI governance board right now. So what we actually rolled out our first part, and I would say it's a baby bite, but we have a whole host of other elements on the menu about to go through and we're about to suggest. But the first part was we actually looked at AI for how do we actually understand all of our comments. So we actually allow comments on every one of our surveys for every question. So this leads us to get anywhere between 70 to sometimes 100,000 plus comments. I know there's organizations of size that are getting more of that. So it's how are you actually going through and understanding that data, and how are you understanding all the rich text data that's out there? Because beforehand, unless you were building very complex ontologies and understanding that yourself, it was almost impossible to do in a timely manner. By the time you finished building it, you're already done with the next cycle. So this has really helped shorten our time period across the board for how we do it. So we actually were able to share our first AI generated complete slide with our leadership team about what do we see coming out of our actual comments and areas of improvement out of our survey focus. And it's really helped shift us to where we've been able to provide some of that in turnaround times for our managing partner, even within minutes versus months. So this is the first part. We're also got some use cases out there. One of our use cases that we're excited about is about objectives in the future, and actually going through and how do you have rubrics that grade performance objectives, and how do you coach people on how to write better objectives. And then we have a whole host of other parts coming down the pipe as well.
That's so exciting. And I love that employee listening piece. I think for years, researchers have really struggled to do, a thorough evaluation of open response comments. And we've seen so much progress in lightning speed on analyzing, theming, even then using it quantitatively. So really exciting to see that happen. I actually heard of one group. We have a case study on a group that focus groups. They use the transcript. They used AI to evaluate, what would take, months to go through in terms of scripts, and, in a number of days. So very exciting.
And I can tell you, my wife just finished her doctorate last August, and she actually used the AI transcript tool for all of her focus groups. And she had held like 50 different focus groups and was able to summarize that in just a absolutely amazingly quick amount of time as they went through it. And you don't need the need for both. As you're hosting a focus group, it also reduces your need for a transcriber as well when you're going through it, because it will instantly transcribe for you too.
Yes, it's just so fascinating. And, I'm excited that she used that as part of her doctoral program, because there's still institutions out there that are prohibiting students from using these devices. And it's like, you've got to learn, while you're in that safe space, how to use it responsibly and effectively. I was just having this conversation last night, in fact. But on to sort of, okay, we did discuss how people analytics is a relatively new field. In our pre-prep planning meeting, we had this conversation about really what it takes to be leading in people analytics, and sort of 3 different acumens that analytics leaders want to focus on, and that might be also important to think about for the rest of HR as we have to upskill our analytical and digital capabilities. I think HR, technical, and business acumens were what we discussed.
Absolutely. So I'm a big believer, and I would love to say that Buddy created this model. I did not. I stole it directly from Nokia, which is the classic data science model. So please give all credit to Nokia for this, like as we went through it. But I'm a really big believer that there are 3 types of acumen, especially for analysts. But this can go for most professional careers as well. And it's how do you balance that? And how do you understand what of these pieces do you want on your team? Because it helps you understand skill set. Because finding somebody with all 3 of them is really what they call, the unicorn of talent. It really very rarely ever exists. But the 3 pieces that you're looking for, the first one, and I am really passionate about this with people analytics, is domain expertise. One of the pieces I've seen that happen, and a lot of times it's when people centralize all of analytics outside of the function, right? And they have just one general analytics function, is you lose the domain expertise of the area. And what that does is it means that somebody, and we talk so much about data storytelling as such a critical piece of it. And if you don't have the domain knowledge, or even if you haven't done like a rotation through other groups within human capital, it hinders your ability to really tell the story of the data all the way through, because you've lost all of that background of what caused that to happen. Because as we all know, data really is a symptom. So it's a symptom of a process. It's a symptom of a practice. It comes about because it's a symptom of the culture. All of these parts come through. And it's only when you have it, just like I tell our teams, like we try to deliver through our human capital business partners. And that delivery has to happen because I tell our human capital business partners all the time, my team sitting in South Campus, and now our team is fully, hybrid. So we have individuals across all the United States and Canada, right, as we go through it. But as we bridge it, that story has to be told through the human capital business partner, the person that's closest to it, because they know it better, right? So as we go through, if you don't have that domain knowledge, you really lose that opportunity to tell the story in that full part, or even sometimes understanding why it is. There's some things we talk about, like I think about attrition modeling, right, as we go through it. But if you don't know the domain of why attrition happens, right? So if you don't know job enablement, theory, or, job embeddedness theory, sorry, as you go through it, where you're talking about a sacrifice, link, and fit, well, you might have a model, but that model was already figured out 30 years ago, as you go through it. Some of these things, like when we say, for example, when you ask somebody when the first book on employee attrition was written, a lot of people won't realize it was written in the 19 teens. It's over 100 plus years old now. It's written about machinists in Michigan, right? So as you go through these pieces of that expertise, it becomes really, really important. The second part is, as you get into it, is around, and I know this is the part that scares a lot of people, is the math expertise, right? So you have to have, I think, the mathematical backbone, and that's in statistics. It's in those components. I'm not asking everybody to be like a PhD in math, right? Or any part like that. And I actually think HR people give themselves the short end of the stick sometimes about how much statistics they know, because we've all been told, oh, HR people aren't good at it. But you're like, most of us went through some elements in college. You might just need a refresher, all of those parts. But it's how do you keep pushing what that is? And I think that's actually really critical. And I'm going to talk about what the most dangerous combination of these three are. And all the HR technologists on the phone are going to throw stuff at me or hang up. So I'm just saying that prevailing. But the third bucket that you also have to know is the HR technology. And this is a part where even a lot of our HR partners fall down, because you really want to know how the sausage gets made. If you're thinking about what that looks like, and having an understanding, and I'm not talking about going to super, super deep understanding, but you have to understand the HR technology to understand as they go through what that looks like. And so it becomes really critical from that HR tech spot to understand what's in your HRMS, where are you getting your performance data, how is that going through, what's the process, how is it going and getting made as we go through it. So you put all of that together and you get like a super data scientist, a super HR people analytics person in the middle of it, which is hard to find, right? And so as you get into it, the most dangerous part of that is if you get someone who's very good in domain, but very good at tech, but very bad at math. Because what happens then is things look incredibly correct. And, we talk about AI hallucinations, but nobody ever talks about people hallucinations. And it is the same concept that goes through. And there are people hallucinations just the same way there are AI hallucinations. So, and I just saw a question come through, Katheryn. I think it's a great time to answer as people asked about the background of our folks. Number one, I am super proud to lead a team of amazingly intelligent and wonderful folks. So we have doctorates across the board. So we have doctorates in IO Psych. We have doctorates across different pieces. So we have a number of IO psychologists as we go through it. We have folks with backgrounds in statistics. We have folks with background across the board. So the background that I'm looking for, if somebody said, Buddy, well, what's the educational background? That doesn't matter to me as much as the first part. I remember the first person I ever interviewed for a people analyst role was a physicist, right? As you go through it. When I think about it, I'm looking for the first trait I'm looking for is curiosity. And I think curiosity is the number one trait of an analyst as we go through. So it doesn't really matter where those parts are, as long as it's coming from that state of curiosity. And then the educational background, right? We're looking for those a few of those requirements across the board. But as we go through, we can work on some of them, and we can also teach domain, which is a part. But you have to learn it. You have to be willing to learn it. You have to be open to learning it, and that part becomes huge.
My next question actually is based off one that was asked at the top of the hour when you were talking about your background, and really it's the importance and rise of soft skills. Someone was asking how your history degree applies today. In this high-tech age, especially as AI is disrupting so much of our workplace, what is your view of the importance of soft skills? And if you could talk about in your own instance, how your liberal arts degree really has helped you get to where you are today.
This is a fascinating and phenomenal question, because I would say it's a lot of times it's the soft skills. Yeah, we don't need to call them soft skills. They're just skills. I think they're skills that, number one, the most important part is listening. So I think listening is it. But I will put something out there for a mentor that I had that's across the board. And his name was Paul Clegg, and he's been retired for quite a while now. I know Paul's never going to see this, but as we go through, Paul told me the number one trait of a human resources professional was empathy. And I believe that more today than ever, because at the end of all of our people data, there is a person attached to it. And if you don't understand and have empathy and understand that promise, you will not get to where you need to go. It also inhibits your consulting skills, which for what we do is super critical. So empathy is the number one piece right off the bat. And because the hard skills, once again, some of the best projects I've ever done with hard skills were the ones that weren't even accepted, right? As you go through, I remember a number of different compensation projects as we go through of what I've done in the past that were literally thrown out. And it's because I didn't bother to listen at the first part for what that is. So the first skill is empathy, and you can build empathy and you can practice empathy, and we can go through that. And obviously, in history, I studied racial violence in Mississippi in the 1930s and 40s, and also in the 1920s. And so empathy was a huge piece of that. The second part, and even though there are definitely people on my team and people, and my wife may disagree vehemently, is the second piece is listening. I find oftentimes that we don't listen very well. And I'll just give an example. How many times have all of us on the call built the deck, and we've built the deck and we're going there, and I've prepared for every question that could ever be asked about this deck that I've built. I've got 100 pages of background documents just in case somebody asks a question. And then what happens when you're giving your presentation or you're walking people through it? You're actually preparing to answer whatever question they have versus actually listening to what they're telling you and getting to the root cause of why they're asking the question. So empathy and listening are at the top two skills that you absolutely have to do. And you have to do it to be really good in the people analytics space, because at the first part, you won't know what questions to go after. You won't understand why the person's asking the question. And ultimately, even if you answer the question technically correct, you won't have the impact that you're looking for without those top two right off the bat.
I think that's a nice segue into our next question, which is about examples of people analytics work at Edward Jones. I know your team does 30 plus projects a year, and you've done some really interesting persona work that I think would stand out amongst people analytics projects. Could you share what was about, how you did it, outcomes?
Yes, I think it's really important. There's a number of number one, I give all credit to the team once again, right off the bat, right? As they go through it. So we have ideas, and they really accomplish, all of these ideas so much. But as we get into this persona work, which I think is laid a background for what we're trying to get to, is it really started with understanding as a head. So we've done, this whole listening ecosystem, and I know a lot of organizations have it. And what we were coming up is we would build traditional personas, which were built on demographics. And I think this is something we see in today's world quite a bit. And I know right now it's a little bit of a dirty word to say intersectionality, but I'm going to talk about intersectionality of all of us for a second. The problem with doing demographic-based personas is the problem of intersectionality, is you are trying to sum up an individual in all of the ways that are in their demographic characteristics. And that complexity is actually too great, right? If you think about just the math behind it, how many different, and we talk about this part, but if you think about how many different demographic groups you belong to, that could be upwards of 30, 35, 40, right? Now think about all the different subgroups of those demographic groups. Now you start multiplying those all together, right? The math of it becomes bigger than the lottery. So when you start getting into what that looks like, it becomes really difficult. So we had the idea, as we were trying to build through it, is what if we actually shifted that and actually did personas based on how people felt? And if we could track across a number of different surveys, which we were able to do with the wonderful help at that point in time, we had Qualtrics, and Qualtrics worked on the back end securely to keep that data from ourselves. But as we were looking at it, and how we joined it. But as we're bridging, it became really important. And that work really helped switch up what we saw. Because we actually, when we did it that way, some of the demographic differences we assigned to people actually disappeared. And it became really the feeling parts about people that feel this way across multiple different um, atmospheres. So as we go through, what that looks like became really huge, and it's really helped us with our colleague experience group, which we've embedded that work continuously, and they use that work to prioritize across interventions that they do, across interventions with it. So that's been a huge piece of what we look for.
Any particular findings from that you could share? Like certain people who feel this way do this, or
Yeah, we actually, it was really interesting. There were I don't want to get too, because I might get hit by the compliance police as we go through it, but I'll share one,
what you
and
can
then
share.
they can complain. But as we get into it, one of the parts that really shifted for us is like what happens with, and I think I just saw this with ethnicity, was really across some of it. A lot of the ethnicity differences shifted because once you actually controlled and all of these other components for, where people came at from a tenure perspective or where they came through, the feelings of people in those other, when you combined all the groups, it kind of blended out that one component. But there were other parts that did come up, like tenure actually got reinforced, right? There are people who were earlier on, but age didn't. So even though tenure and age are almost always highly related to one another, right? Just because of the math involved. In this case, it just became, oh, it's about where you're at in your life cycle, which we hear about all the time in the employee life cycle, but it becomes really reinforcing about how are you actually looking at some of these components. But it then becomes a myriad of other demographics as you go through. Because as part of that, for the average respondent of that, we had 3 years of data, multiple years of data that were coming through. I don't want to say 3 is multiple years of data, but we also had all of those demographic variances that people have, which led to it. So definitely really key findings about where do you go for and where people are at. In some other areas, depending on what you're talking about, where people are at in pay cycles, where people are at, across the board.
That's fascinating. You mentioned at the start of the story that you used Qualtrics and it kept data sort of behind, so you were protected from it. And I know that you've worked on data governance issues for some time. Can you talk about how that's structured at Edward Jones? How do you do, responsible data governance?
No, absolutely. And, this is a part where we could always get better at data governance. I think I saw the question in the chat pop up really quickly too. And I always think data governance could get better. I mean, I think we're seeing some of that even nationwide now, with what we could do and how quickly it can be broken. The data governance part is critical. So before coming to Jones, I was at Bayer/Monsanto. So the great part about being Edward Jones, we're in the United States and Canada, so we don't have to deal with GDPR, which I know there's a lot of folks here that do. And bless you for doing it, because before I came here, when I was at Bayer Monsanto, both GDPR and Works Councils, will teach you about data governance a lot quicker as we go through it. But data governance here at the firm, I'm really excited about here, and I will tell you why. One is we actually go for any of our projects, we actually get them approved by legal first. So my first conversation, whenever somebody comes up to me with a question and I go, hey, we're going to go after it, is my first call. And they're probably tired of me because I always like hit legal up with it's at 5 p.m. for 10 minutes, 15 minutes. Hey, we need to talk before we even start the process of going through it, because we have to know whether or not we're on the right side. And, I always tell people there's folks that will do creepy stuff with your data, and there's folks that will tell you that they won't do creepy stuff with your data and then do creepy stuff with your data. And we try to stay out of the creepy stuff kind of, pieces, even though we know sometimes people will. Now, that's not saying that Buddy in his heart of hearts wouldn't go do creepy stuff, probably would, but luckily with legal and data governance, we don't have it. Our data governance group is actually outside of a human capital. So I'm really excited about that, because that forces a partnership and it creates a more inclusive lens of looking at it. So we can step away from going and say, hey, is that right? Are we doing the right part? And are we going through it? So we have a data governance board. We also have a separate AI governance board that for any projects we go through. So we submit and we talk with those folks about our projects as we go through it for any of our human capital reporting requests. And I get held to this same part too, because I will tell you, and I think I saw maybe a few of our human capital, our talent intelligence folks, even on the call today, they know because I'll request data and they're like, well, Buddy, do you have legal approval? Has this gone through data governance? And I'll be like, what do you mean? I'm the one asking for it. And then they go, yeah, but you still have to go through it. So they even keep me in check as we go through it as well.
I think that's
I see
actually
Atika. Atika is one of our amazing colleagues. And so Atika is even saying she can attest to this.
Oh, I see. I think that's a great structure to keep everybody above board. And one of the things that I've heard you talk about, as well as other analytics leaders on our board, is the importance of communicating to the workforce to tell them, what are you going to do with the data? What do you not collect? And that's so critical to developing trust, which is where I'm going with my next question, because a year or so ago, I interviewed you along with Rob Cross, esteemed Babson College professor and our senior VP of research here at I4CP, to talk about team effectiveness. And you stood out because you all were working on at the time and now have an assessment to look at team effectiveness, agnostic of function. And a lot of it has to do with trust. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, well, I actually just saw Paul Thorson jump in on the chat as well. So Paul T actually leads our team effectiveness assessment piece, actually at Jones as well. And so Paul has been great at helping us get that set up and administering and delivering lots of value as we go through it. So we've become obsessed really about teaming as we look at that at the at the firm. And the reason why is the first part, we've started in our what we call our home office, which is our corporate part, which is about a little around 9,500 folks. But the reason why that started there is because for our financial advisors, for a long time, our model was one financial advisor, one branch. And that's rapidly becoming multiple financial advisors. So the construct of teaming becomes even more critical for us as a business imperative function. But as we were looking at team effectiveness and we're bridging it in, is really like, how do you actually understand whether the teams are effective and what does it look like? And because when we start to talk about individual effectiveness, it's what is the unit of measurement, right? So if you actually think about most of your metrics that you have at an organization, even though we like to think of them as organizational metrics, we only actually have two levels. We have individual, and sorry, I talk with my hands too, which they just wave in and out of the Zoom as we go through. But you have the organizational kind of effectiveness metric, and then you have the individual effectiveness metric. And what you're really missing all the way through that is the fact that all the rest of the actual ways we get work done are all through teams. And so if you're not actually looking at how do you understand the effectiveness of the team itself and the makeup of the team, and one of the outcomes of this study that really came through, and I give Paul T a lot of credit for this, was the fact that teams actually operate differently if you think about it. So if you think about most functional leadership teams, and I'll throw down the gauntlet for this, do your functional leadership teams actually act as teams? Are they actually acting as individualized silos that report up to one individual? And most of the time, it's actually the latter and not the former. So it's how do you actually create that teaming and actually understanding that impact? And that comes through a whole host of behavioral pieces. And this is why that future of people analytics really is, I think, in this behavioral component of going, how do you build trust? How do you understand roles and responsibility? How do you understand goal setting? How do you understand the culture that you're trying to bridge as a team? And not just speaking that, which I think happens a lot, but actually how do you build that through team norms and understanding and what that looks like and how we relate to one another? So this part becomes really critical, and we become really obsessed with it. We're still doing the assessments. We've still had a few parts as we go through. within the home office, and we're still working at what that looks like. Have we gotten that to perfection yet? The answer is absolutely no. I think a lot of times we find something out, and it just leads us down a rabbit hole of 20 more questions about what this looks like, because a lot of it I think is new. But I see a future where you're really looking, like if you're thinking about metrics, where you're looking at individual measures of success, and then you're really looking more so at team levels of success as you're thinking about what are the symptoms of organizational distress.
And I think that's such a fascinating and future of work type way of thinking about the organization, because so much of what we do is managed to one. Think about our performance management process and individual performance reviews, and the way that we incentivize performance and productivity is so individually based. And if you think about it more as a network, and a network of teams specifically and how they interact, it can be much more effective. And I4CP's research, Rob Cross's years of research as well, really back that up. So you're really kind of, you're running ahead of everybody else. Who do you tap to check, like, do you have a peer, for instance, out there that you'd be like, I want to go do this. I want to measure team effectiveness. Like, where do you start for that? And, what's the value of sort of a community of practice?
Oh, it's such a great question, Katheryn. One, the first part is our own internal team. They get the weirdest questions from me all the time, and then they tell me that's insane, and I'm okay with it, as we look forward. Or they tell me that's actually doable, and we can figure it out. But from building this up, I will tell you, number one, I4CP has been a tremendous partner for me for this for a number of years. I remember when I first joined the I4CP People Analytics Board, which was a number of years ago when I was at Monsanto. I remember Alexis Fink was one of the first folks, that was on that with us. But there's been a ton of folks over the years. So in my life, I've belonged, and I really believe in belonging to groups like I4CP. And that's not just me blowing smoke because I'm here talking today. It's true. I think you have to have the network to share ideas and go through it. It's also started with it used to be called the Attrition Retention Consortium, and now it's called the PAC. It's a consortium of about 25, 30 companies. And I was actually the head of the Analytics and Retention Consortium for quite a bit. And, having that group, I remember the first model I ever built, I stole from Ford. I remember, and it was about predicting overall hiring in a year. And it was actually a gentleman in Ford, his name was Rob Tripp. He had written a great workforce planning book. If you ever I don't even know, it's probably still not being published, but it was, if it's on Amazon, you might be able to find it. But Rob had built a model all the way back in it about, like, how do you understand seasonality within hiring models? And so we actually adapted it. This was back at Raytheon to predict the amount of hires in a given year. And I remember it was the first time we had ever done a true prediction of what that looks like. And when we did it, I remember I shared the results out for the first time, and one of the heads of TA of the businesses looked at me and says, Buddy, that is, baloney. It's not going to be anywhere close to that. And you're off by like 5,000 folks. And if you're right, I'll give you 500. Well, $500. And I remember I was right within 30 people. And he was off by about 5,000 people, and I never saw $500. But it also gets you back to, how do you understand and what does it look like? And I've had the joy of also getting to go to Talreos, which is a Northwestern conference every year, where you meet some of the folks that have really shaped, a lot of the stuff where I think about externally, like Ian O'Keefe or Amit Mahindra, or like if you go and read, the top articles in People Analytics, it's really, really critical. I will tell you, I'm also a big believer in development. Our team knows as we go, how do we go through it? I am a big believer in doing development every single day. So I literally gear myself up for development and conversations every day. And I hold myself accountable to, did I do that every single day as well? But belonging to a group, the other important part of belonging to a group, and I can't stress this enough, is that there are going to be times when you do this job where you're going to have shown something really great and it's going to bomb, or it's not going to be well received, or the organization isn't ready for the change. Or, a lot of times people come to us with questions they already know the answers for, and they're just looking for you to already prove their point. And when you don't, it can be disappointing. And you have to have people to talk to and walk through those circumstances with into who have lived it. So every time you get to go to a conference, like if you get to go to I4CP's conference, I highly recommend it. Is getting and meeting people who've gone through that same journey with you so that you also have that empathy back to it from the skilled perspective to build through it and keep going.
Thank you for the kind words on I4CP and the I4CP People Analytics Board. Your check is in the mail.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
I think that was a really holistic view of how many groups that are out there where you can find peers and really bounce ideas off of, because that's so important to advancing people analytics and how we move forward. Can you talk to me about the future of people analytics, if you will? We have this conversation frequently on the board. I would love to explore a little bit more about what does this look like, especially as AI democratizes access to data across the organization, and people's analytical capabilities progress as well as a result. What does a people analytics department look like? What does it do?
Absolutely. I think, sometimes in my life, I like to think that all of human capital will become just people analytics, right? And even though it won't be called that, the actual skill sets will be. But I think that's a bit of ways yet. But as we go through it, I think number one, you just hit on. I know we talked a little bit about what I think the three organizations are for the future. I know we've talked a lot about that today. But this next part, and we've talked a little bit about the skill sets. I think the skill sets of empathy and listening become even more critical. Because the problem that people have with AI is they actually still, and this is, I just find this overwhelming, and I fall into the trap. I'm not saying perfect at this at all, but it's asking the right questions. And AI will actually make that even more dangerous. So think if you don't know, as you think about your organizational setup, and this gets back to the domain expertise of technology, what happens when you say, I would like to know the sentiment of something from all of human capital, for example? Well, what happens if you actually have a department within human capital called human capital and not just the division? Now, are you getting results from the actual division or are you getting results from the department? And I know that's very tactical, but the importance of even actually getting super specific for how to ask questions becomes critical. So people analytics will have to continue to evolve that skill set to being the best question askers that you can get to. So then on top of that, you have to continuously build to be, after you ask the question, are you the best at building hypotheses that are testable? Because you can put your statement into AI and you can go to ChatGPT. And ChatGPT is just one, by the way. We have to talk about the fact that we typically reference, most AI people reference is just ChatGPT versus the hundreds and thousands of other models that are out there for AI that go through it. But as you bridge it, what does that look like? So we're going to have to continually push ourselves in that area. I think the future of it is, if you think about base level reporting, is probably a difference. Like if you think about 2 years from now, 3 years from now, asking a question of like, well, getting the question of like, well, what's been the attrition over the last year? That question goes away because people will have access to that question. So the questions become more and more detailed. So then it becomes, and it gets to, and I'm going to get really maybe a little bit controversial here, right? The questions will eventually evolve to should questions. So the questions won't be even around, like, say, take attrition, right? You start off with attrition. What was the attrition last year? What's the attrition today? Could you give me a roster of all the people that quit? All of those questions start to end. Then it becomes, well, why did that person leave? You're even going to get that type of analysis done automatically. Then it starts to go, well, what's the likelihood of this person leaving, right? You get into predictive, and that's going to be it. But then what's going to get at the heart of most people analytics groups is the question of, should that person leave? And not, will it be better off? Like, so if you think about talent management, I think of talent management as being this untapped super pool of what it is. And when we talk about things like succession planning, you start talking about pieces like performance management, you start talking about this, and you actually start to get to the should questions. It's going to create a completely different world for what that looks like when we think about the overall talent flow of organizations, and actually thinking about this might be a little Taoist as we go through this, it's the way the river runs. I am actually a big believer. We don't actually know how most of our organizations run because it's an organism that's made up of thousands and thousands and thousands of microorganisms. And I'm not trying to talk about people as if they're like organisms here, but as you go through it, we don't really we have so much untapped potential in what all of the understanding of not of what those relationships are, the interactions are, what should those relationships be like, how prescriptive do we actually go before we get creepy, what does all of this look like together? And we still have a future out there where we have not answered the most important questions that we think exist because we haven't discovered what the most important questions are yet. So that's what I'm really looking forward to with the future of people analytics. Right now, that's today, Katheryn. Tomorrow you might get me. I'll be like, oh my goodness, can we just get the HCMS to work properly? And that will be the future. We could be really happy about it. But when I think about what the realm of the possible is, I get really excited about that this is historically still there.
So you see, folks, why I call him the sage of analytics, right? Like that, and the fact that he busted out the first book on attrition in 1919. We have just a few minutes left, and if I could ask, for all of those people analytics leaders that are professionals on the call today or who will be watching this later, what's one piece of advice that you have for them?
My piece of advice is this might sound people said soft skills. I'm gonna just say it's it. Start with trust. And what do I mean by that? It's if you think about being a good consultant is when people are coming to you for questions, a lot of times I hear people analysts like, well, why don't our business partners understand this? Why don't they get this? Why don't they? And it's the part is they're coming to you because they're looking for a place of trust and they're looking for results at some point. But a lot of times it's looking for the conversation and bridging it. So it's if you operate from that first part of trust and empathy with why the question is being asked, I guarantee you that your results will get better, right, as we get through, and they will develop and get to the spots where they need to be too. So my always key advice is start out with trust. My second piece of advice is really the data architecture and data pieces within the organization. The results will replicate that. So you have to understand the processes. And a lot of times with our people analytics leaders, you have to become a bit of a jack of all trades too, because you kind of have to get the flavor of all the different parts of human capital to do that. And so it's part of that is really, and this is sometimes people think it sounds silly, is I love the practice of human capital, right? I love the practice of human resources. And it's getting to be, an expert in different areas of that too, to understand what that looks like. Because that's a lot of times what's causing the issues. It's not the other pieces of it.
Excellent advice. Thank you so much, Buddy. It's been a great hour. I'll turn it over to Tom to wrap us up.
Well, I'll certainly second that. So many great insights shared, Buddy. We've already got comments coming through in the chat with kudos. A few folks that had to log off early, but wanted to get their thanks in. So really appreciate it. Great conversation today. Also, just want to note a couple of final reminders. Our conference is coming up fast, less than 2 weeks, March 3rd through the 6th. I realize for many of you, if you haven't already registered, it might be too late to get those travel plans in, but if you can last minute, please do join us out in Scottsdale. We do also have a virtual option for attending the conference. Obviously, you miss out on the in-person networking and other benefits of being there in person, but you do get to watch all of the speakers and the sessions that you see just a small sampling of here on the screen. So do consider that virtual option if you can't join us in person. And lastly, all Next Practices weekly sessions are available for recertification credit hours. So if that applies to you, you've got an HRCI or SHRM cert, jot down the relevant program ID or activity ID that you see here on the screen, or that our colleague Zeta had put in the chat just a moment ago. With that, a quick reminder, we will not be having Next Practices Weekly next week or the week after due to our conference coming up, but we'll be back with you in March soon after. So have a great rest of your week, everyone. Once again, thank you, Buddy. Thank you, Zeta, Matt, and thank you, Katheryn, for facilitating the conference today, or the conversation today. Great session. Have a great weekend, everyone.